So please welcome Matthew Betts.
Thank you, Tom, for a very long introduction.
I promised him it would be short.
It was nearly entirely factually correct. I will, so Tom asked me, I think it was at the Andrews when Tom asked me to come here. This is the second time I've come and spoken with you all. And I have to say yes to Tom because in my mind, he is the biggest salamander celebrity for Oregon and Washington. So he's as a trade, I'm not going to take cash, but he is going to tell me where to find a giant coastal salamander terrestrial adult.
Tomorrow afternoon.
Or maybe tomorrow afternoon.
You're gonna have to throw in a.
So the one correction I'll make was that I was no industry insider at all. In fact, I worked for an environmental NGO after my master's. And the thing I was faced with time and time again when I started talking about biodiversity in forests and community forestry was, what do you know? You don't even have a forestry degree. How do you have any idea what we really do out here? And so I took that as sort of a challenge. And I went back and did my second undergraduate, if you can believe it, in forestry to test the hypothesis that foresters knew what they were talking about, or I would learn a whole lot. And it turned out I learned a whole lot. So that's where I come from this. What I'm not going to talk about today, gosh, I hope this works. Maybe not. Oh no, we had all this excellent, oh, here we go. So what I'm not going to talk about today is this topic, which I talked about the last time I was here. We spent 15 years now studying this species, Heliconia tortuosa, and its interaction with 30 hummingbird species in southern Costa Rica. And it's a system that's given me, I've always had a love for nature, but the complexity of this system has absolutely blown my mind. And it's why I continue to focus on how we can best conserve forests for biodiversity, but still use them as humans. So I think I don't need to tell any of you in this room or brag about the benefits of forests. They don't cover a large portion of the terrestrial planet, less than a third, but they house more than 80% of all terrestrial life. So disproportionately diverse. 1.6 billion people depend directly on forests for their livelihoods. Most of our medicines, at least originated from plants that grow in forests. Many of them are synthesized now. So obviously, forests are tremendously important. Really push this forward because I like to pace around nervously as I talk. Okay. So some of you have probably seen these sorts of data before, but I'm going to show it to you again. The pink is forest loss across South America from the year 2000 onwards. And you'll see the rate of change as I go here. And this was a time actually pre-Bolsonaro. I think a lot of people don't realize how quickly tropical forest is changing across the world. I wish I could show you Borneo as well, where I teach a field course, but it's still absolutely immense rate of change, 1.5 million square kilometers per year. And as probably doesn't surprise you, given the biodiversity that exists in forests, this is driving extinctions globally. And if you have a chance to read it, maybe this should be your next speaker, Elizabeth Kleber, a very good book called The Sixth Extinction. And in it, she argues that we've had 5 more natural extinction events in Earth's history. Now we have a 6th one, and it's being caused by humans. This is a paper by Ceballos and others, estimating extinction rates are about 100 to 1,000 times the background rate or the normal rate of extinction. So sorry to start the talk off on a bit of a sad note. What's happened on the conservation biology front is what often happens when faced with threat. Conservation biologists are arguing against each other. And in one camp are the people who argue that the way we should best conserve biodiversity on Earth is just to do softer agricultural practices. So think about organically grown vegetables. Think about having nice, gentle landscapes like this one in Costa Rica. On the other side, we have people who, and I would say represented by E.O. Wilson, who hopefully many of you have heard about, argue really what we need is not mixing human uses with nature. We need to have large conservation areas. And in order to pay for those conservation areas, we're going to grow our crops very efficiently and intensively with very high production. Okay, who's heard of this land sharing versus land sparing debate? I'm curious, just a show of hands. Okay, so a number of you have. Question. The amount of roundwood consumed and produced on one axis, and we've got human population on the other axis here. And you can see that the more humans there are, the more we consume. You could have the exact same figure for food consumption. This is a linear relationship in lockstep. Yeah. Oh, sorry, just wood. Yeah, all sorts of wood. Yeah. There's no square wood or rectangular. Like, there is, but it's not what they call it. So the question, and I hope you're not here thinking you're just going to get to sit back in your chairs and not do much. Because really you're going to help. Today we're going to solve this problem. We're going to ask the question, how should we best conserve Earth's forests? And throughout, at the very end of the presentation, we'll do a poll and ideally a discussion. And partway through, I'm going to keep you aware by asking you a number of questions. So, and I'll call out at random. So this is a paper we produced just a few years ago now. It shows you that, sure, forest loss impacts are bad globally. Those are the red bits. But the proportion of forests worldwide, those are the green bits that are managed for timber, is absolutely immense. It dwarfs the red, if you can see that on the map, right? And the brighter the green, the more intensively managed that forest is. So the less intensively managed forests are kind of a darker color, you see? So the wood baskets of the world, the places that most wood is produced. We can just turn this off, is that possible? No. Are here, southeastern US, of course, the Pacific Northwest is a huge wood basket. Fennoscandia up here, to a certain extent down in Brazil in the Atlantic forest, and then southern China. So most of the wood in the world is produced in those areas, and the footprint is huge. So today, I'm going to talk about 4 chapters. The first is the effect of global forest loss on biodiversity. The second is closer to home in Oregon, the effect of old growth on bird conservation and microclimate. I'll talk also about intensive management in Oregon. I'm sure many of you are familiar with clear cuts and spraying in the Coast Range here, for example. And then the reason you really need to pay attention is because at the end, we'll do this social science poll. Okay, is everyone ready? Good, off we go. So this is the trickiest one. This is probably one that has the most data, so we'll walk through it gradually. So the effect of global forest loss on biodiversity. I just want to point out this beautiful picture by a friend, Kristen Ziegler, and you can just sense how much tree canopy diversity there is by all the different shades of green, can't you? I mean, in a single plot in our study area, there are 800 species of trees. So back to the sharing sparing debate, what I wanted to ask you was whether you're a sharer or a sparer. So if you were trying to conserve global biodiversity, would you rather have an intact landscape, or would you with and grow crops really intensively, or would you rather have a sharing approach where you have interspersed growth of crops? A. Who says A? Okay, so sparers, amazing. Okay, all right. So related to that, then the point of this particular paper was to ask, if you were to cut down forest for wood, where would it have the biggest impact initially? Would it have, if you cut trees in this landscape that's already intact, but you're just initially intruding into it, will that have a bigger impact on biodiversity? Or would it have a bigger impact on a landscape that's already lost quite a bit of forest? Okay, so a bit of a different question. Would you get your wood from a landscape that might look resilient because it's got lots of forest in it already? Or would you go somewhere that's already lost a lot? So who says A? We should get wood from okay, not very many. Yeah, we're consistent with our sharing sparing. Who says B? So there'll be less impact by getting wood from here. Okay, interesting. All right, so here, what we did for this, it was a true global study. And nowadays it's amazing. We can get remote sensing data from the whole planet and look at rates of forest change. I showed you a video of that earlier in the presentation. Okay, so zooming in at 30-meter pixel resolution, the red here are places that have lost forest, the green is stayed stable with forest. And the blue is gaining forest. And the purple is it's lost and then it's gained, actually. So really detailed resolution data of how forests are changing globally. And we also have an amazing data set from the IUCN that lists species the degree to which they're endangered. Okay, has anyone heard of this data set? We have our state level endangerment and national, but this is a global. Experts sit around in a panel, probably Tom does, and determines which species should be endangered. And so we use data from this set. Is a species endangered, basically? Is the species in a low threat category, but it's at risk of going higher? And what's the likelihood the population is declining? So we are interested overall on the effect of forest loss on these three things, okay? So I'm going to skip this bit, but we have these two hypotheses. One is we're going to see greater risk to species in landscapes that have low initial forest cover. The other is we're going to see greater risks to species in places that have high initial cover. This is going to be the biggest impact, okay? So I'll walk you through this figure slowly. This is forest cover on the x-axis in the year 2000, and on the y-axis is how much forest has been lost. Okay, and we should see, under the idea that intact forests are the most sensitive, we should be seeing the risk of being threatened, declining, and being uplisted, the highest probability. Okay, and that's exactly what we see here. You can see in landscapes that were initially high forest cover in the year 2000, if they've lost 15% of their forest cover, the risk of a species being threatened is really high. Do you follow? A little bit. So, and that the same follows for declining species and uplisting as well. And this, by the way, this is for species that are only associated with forest. We call them forest exclusive species. The same pattern for species that kind of like forest. We still see intact landscapes are the most sensitive to change. And then I guess reassuringly, we see that for species that don't like forest at all, there's really no effect. Or in fact, they like open areas more, okay? So in the end then, actually I think this is the first audience I've ever had go almost unequivocally toward A being the most sensitive, so congratulations.
Wait till you get the Q&A.
Okay, oh yeah, okay. So the question a lot of people ask is, well, and they're annoyed that they were wrong because they picked B, and they wonder why that would be. And we don't really know the answer because we haven't been on the ground collecting these data, but these are two hypotheses we have. One is that when you start punching roads, especially into tropical forests, it has an initial impact of people getting in there more easily and hunting more easily. And these are landscapes filled with animals, of course. And the other one is that humans tend to like wood that very sensitive species like to live in, specialists. And so maybe it's true that for this bare-eyed antbird that likes big, old-growth tropical forests, we're hitting those areas first and causing declines in those species. So those are our two thoughts about that. Last bit on this chapter, we did analysis of where in the world is fragmentation likely to be the worst. This is a follow-up to the first paper. And we had all these data sets from the whole planet where people had intensively collected biodiversity data. And we asked, first of all, is there a latitudinal gradient in how sensitive species are to fragmenting the forest? And we also asked if that sensitivity is because species that live in the tropics have not experienced much disturbance in their evolutionary history. Okay, in Oregon, historically, we've had a lot of fires. And of course, where I'm from in Canada, we've had glaciers rushing back and forth across the continent. So if you're a species that doesn't like change, you're kind of gone. We call this the extinction filter hypothesis. So in theory then, tropical areas that have low disturbance should be the most sensitive to fragmentation. And we mapped these different disturbance types across the planet. And sure enough, this is what we found. If you're at high latitude, a small proportion of the species are fragmentation sensitive. If you're at near the equator, you've got a lot of species that are sensitive to forest fragmentation. Okay. Now, where do you think most of the pressure comes from for deforestation and fragmentation in the tropics? Why is it under pressure? Cattle, okay. Who eats said cattle?
It's the, yeah. Shift in other methods.
Yeah, it's a lot of the people up at this range of latitude that are causing the problems at this latitude. And I just started thinking about this maybe a decade ago, and we now have a project in our lab group that's trying to really focus on what we call exporting the consequences of our consumption. And one of the coolest papers I've come across, this is not ours, but out of Japan, Murano Kinmoto, looked at this particular example is just the US, but they've done it for all countries in the world. And they asked the question, what are the impacts of US consumption habits on endangerment worldwide? And so if you see a dark color of purple, the answer is we're importing stuff from that country, and those products are causing declines in the habitat for sensitive species. You follow? Okay, so this is a really important area of research, I think, to understand the specifics. This was a bit of a rough cut, but to understand the specifics of where our imports come from and what the impacts are. All right, how's everyone doing now? Good. Okay, so now we're going to move close to home. This is the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. How many people have been up to Blue River and seen? Oh, wow. Gosh, I'd like to come here and talk again, Tom. So, yeah, this is a much finer scale question that required a lot of field work. Can forest structure buffer birds against climate change? And we're interested more broadly in biodiversity. So we're not allowed to put it in our next grant proposal, the word climate, but it turns out climate is, I'm actually not even joking. We would not get funded. And we were nearly defunded because we had it in our last proposal. But climate change is happening. It's not good for species. Well, that's all I have to say about that. This is a famous paper by a colleague of mine at University of York that came out in 2004, and they used modeling to predict that the future of climate change on species is really dire. And this still stands. 13 to 36% of species committed to extinction by 2050. So the problem is the methods used in this paper, well, I'll show you them. What they do in these projections of what will happen to biodiversity under climate change is they build a model in the current day. This isn't the current day, but they build a model, and then they use global circulation models to predict forward into the future what will happen. And then they test to see if a species is no longer within its climatic niche. Okay, so sorry for the detail there, but we tested this idea by backcasting. So we built distribution models for species way back in 1983, and we projected forward in time to 2010. And then we tested to see if those actually worked for species like this rufous hummingbird and actually a whole suite of bird species. And the answer was they didn't really work very well. Does anyone have an idea for why we're using climate data to predict distributions of species? We're modeling that climate forward in time, and we're finding that we didn't really get it right. We're not getting abundance right.
Is it because climate change is accelerating?
That's a possibility. Yeah.
You need to know the range at which animals can survive. The temperature.
Yeah, you need to know their thermal tolerances. Yeah. Does anyone know much about where the data for these climate models are collected? Like, what does a climate station look like? They look, so we're often wrong. That's the point. They look like this. This is one of the Andrews. And so for someone like me that studies species that live in forests, can you see the problem with this setup? So the issue is that really very few people have collected data under canopy in the forest. And more than a decade and a half ago now, we were some of the first to start it at the Andrews. So yeah, this black-throated gray warbler, I took this photo, by the way. Yeah, it is not It is not living in conditions like this. It's able to move around in the canopy and experience different temperatures. On a hot day, it might go somewhere different to where it's going on a cold day. So the point was of this study, we wanted to find out within the Andrews, which at the time was primarily either old growth or these 40 to 70-year-old plantations, how much variability there was in microclimate under the canopy. So it's time for you to vote again. And if I were to ask you which is likely to be cooler during the hottest months of the year, plantation, closed canopy, or old growth forest? Who says old growth? Let's do hands again. Wow, okay. And who says plantation? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so this is Sarah Fry. She's a grad student of mine, still works at OSU. And she and her husband, Adam, and I instrumented the H.J. Andrews with microclimate data loggers and across an elevational gradient, across an old growth to plantation gradient. It was epic. I mean, these dots are all places still have microclimate loggers, and they're places where we count birds 3 times a year each spot. And this is what the microclimate loggers look like. They're these little hobo things covered with a shield. And we just get immense amounts of data from them every single year. And so this enabled Sarah to pair those climate data with really detailed images from LiDAR of forest structure and ask the degree to which complex forest structure in old growth versus simple forest structure in plantations influences microclimate. So here we go. Is Tom correct about plantations being cooler? So this is a gradient from plantations to old growth. And on the y-axis is how hot it is during the bird breeding season, just as an example. Here you can see some LiDAR shots of plantation and old growth. And this is what we found. So it's actually it's a massive effect size going from the simplest forest at the Andrews, no clear cuts, no young plantations, just older plantations through old growth. It's about 2.5 degrees cooler on a hot late June day than it is in plantations. So this was actually an important finding to us and somewhat surprising. Since then, we've built on it, and this is a postdoc in our group. It's not just looking at whether it's colder or hotter, or whether the trend in temperature is different. Okay, and for this, we can rely on we do at the Andrews have some stations that go all the way back to 1985, just 4 of them, and we can test the degree to which we see differences in slopes. And really remarkably, the open stations are warming about twice the speed as if you're in forest. So this gives more motivation for conserving closed canopy forests. The paper's still in review. So these papers have gotten a bunch of interesting press. Old growth forests provide buffer against rising temperatures. That's kind of correct. But then we had some that said things like old growth forests can help preserve biodiversity in a warming world. We didn't measure biodiversity in that study at all, so I'm not sure where they got that from. Or woodlands can help protect wildlife from global change, I think that was. So seeing this press made us realize we really need to try to get to the bottom of whether or not this buffering in microclimate actually has relevance for populations of animals. And so to do that, at the time, we didn't have a long-term data set for the H.J. Andrews. But what we do have are these breeding bird survey routes across the whole Western US. Has anyone here ever done a breeding bird survey route? Or do you know who knows what they are? Yeah, it's an amazing data set. These are 50-kilometer long routes. People have counted birds on them every year since 1966. So one of the best examples of a long-term continental scale data set. And so we use those data along with, these are prism data, climate data. The red spots are places in our landscape that have gotten hot over the last 30 years, and the blue spots are places that have gotten a bit cooler. And then this is a map of forest structure, blue being old growthy and red being less old growthy. Okay, so all we did was we asked, have populations along these routes declined more in landscapes that don't have old growth and have heated the most? Okay, pretty simple stuff, kind of. So this is one of our friends, Wilson's warbler. On this axis, we have old growth proportion. This is how hot it's gotten. Some places in the landscape have warmed 2 degrees just over the last 40 years. And this is what we see. So if there's a lot of heating and there's no old growth, populations are declining over 4% per year. But if there's lots of old growth and lots of heating, the population trends aren't negative at all. Okay? So basically the conclusion of this, albeit correlative work, is that bird populations do better. If it's warmed a lot in the landscape, bird populations do better if there's lots of old growth in the landscape. And this was the same for a number of species, including the star of the show, hermit warbler. And then this PhD student of mine, Hong-Kyu Kim from South Korea, many years later, this is somewhat frustrating because it's based on the BBS data are amazing, but they're not really rigorous because we can't account for differences in observers and imperfect detection. So finally at the Andrews, we got enough data to actually test using our really rigorous point count data. And he found the same thing, that the birds that are in old growth tend to be staying, and the ones in plantation tend to wink out in hot years. Okay. So I'm going to give, I guess Jamie Cornelius gave you a singing break, and I would drive all of you out of the room if I did that. So I'm just going to give you an old growth break here. And this, I think you've had my doctoral student, Nina Ferrari, come and talk. So this is, you're going to see her in this tree. We really wanted to express to people just how big an old growth tree is. When you're on the ground, you look up and it's trapezoidal, right? But as you go up, if you're climbing a tree, it stays, there she is, it stays the same diameter the whole way up. And so those of you that didn't see Nina's talk, what she's doing is she's asking, how does this microclimatic buffering capacity of old growth change as you go up into the canopy? So she's got microclimate loggers the whole way up to the top. And she's also got bioacoustics data, which enables her to pinpoint birds of different species at all different times of day to ask if on a hot day, birds go somewhere cooler. On a cool day, they go up. And there's Mark Schultz at the top, who's one of my heroes. But I mean, it's incredible. So how many of you have climbed an old growth tree? Yes, good. Oh, a few of you have, good. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, really? Well, that makes me so happy. So, so it's all well and good for us to have egos about our old growth in Oregon and how it's potentially buffering against climate change. And I would go out and give this talk and brag about that to people in other parts of the world. And then this happened. So in the blink of an eye, in July of 2023, lightning struck in the upper range of the Andrews in old growth, and this lookout fire took hold and ended up burning about 2/3 of the HJ Andrews at sort of mixed severity. And I have a grad student now who is looking at those microclimate data pre and post. So how much do you think microclimate has gone up in places that burned severely?
Temperature, you mean?
Temperature, yeah. Yeah, about 6 degrees Celsius. So that 2.5-degree wind I just showed you is, yeah. Anyway, it's a very interesting time to be doing work at the Andrews. Okay, so second last chapter. I'm now going to talk about intensive management in Oregon. How am I doing for time? 5 to 10 minutes, I think I can be. So I also spend a lot of time in these landscapes that are extremely different to the HJ Andrews. And the question is, what are the effects of this sort of management on biodiversity? And it's really important because globally speaking, plantations are getting more and more common. Most of our wood is coming from plantations. This is particularly the case in tropical forests. So obviously, it's a very controversial practice that's used generally to grow trees quickly. What happens is you've got a variety of herbicides being sprayed. The basic idea is that they're spraying herbicides to control competing vegetation to Douglas fir. And the argument is that unless you reduce that competing vegetation, Douglas fir won't grow quickly, or the plantation will fail completely. And this has been linked to bee deaths, they're being linked to human health, and I probably don't need to tell you that whole story. So as soon as I arrived in Oregon, actually, one of the first things I got interested in was what's the impact of really intensive management. This is a plantation on industrial land really near here. versus less intensive management. This was still clear cut, but much less in the way of spray. And my motivation for that was everyone was doing work on spotted owls 20 years ago. And I thought I think I want to be a spotted owl researcher. And in the end, I turned out to be one a little bit. But what I wanted to focus on were these early several species that seemed to be kind of the forgotten children of forest biodiversity. And when I first pulled out the breeding bird survey data, this is what I saw. That's orange-crowned warbler on the left, rufous hummingbird on the right. And they're declining at the time. And actually, although slowed a bit, they're still declining quickly, about 4% per year, which at the time was about the same rate as the northern spotted owl. So I got interested in conservation of those species, and asked in particular whether or not they were declining because of intensive management. The alternative hypothesis, of course, was that with the Northwest Forest Plan, forest on federal lands was growing up and closing canopy and was no good for those species anymore. But in the project I'm going to talk to you about today, this is mainly focused on intensive management. And do we see trade-offs between biodiversity and timber production, which would be bad news for the prognosis for us having our cake and eating it too. Okay, and some collaborators here, 2 students and Jake Verskyle, a collaborator. So here we're going to vote. See how optimistic you feel tonight. Will we see a trade-off between the more timber we produce, the less biodiversity we're going to have? Hold on to it for a sec. Will we just see no real effect of timber production on biodiversity? Or is it going to be happy times and we're going to see lots of timber, really good for biodiversity? So who votes trade-off? Okay, all right, some pessimists. Who says neutral? Okay, and then anyone say it's going to be synergistic, positive? Nobody at all, okay. But we should have brownies maybe. That would make people vote more on the synergistic side. So I have to say we're really lucky with this project because it occurred on state lands, Oregon Department of Forestry, and on industrial lands, some of the big ones you know about. And we convinced managers to do an actual experiment at full scale of a stand and replicate that again and again. And so we had 4 treatments. Keep your eye on these colors because they're really important. The control had no spray whatsoever. Clear cut, planted, no spray. Light was 2 sprays. Not typical, but on Oregon Department of Forestry land, more common. Moderate is the industrial standard. That's actually a spray before you plant, and 2 sprays after you plant. So 3 sprays. And then we have the intensive treatment, which was, we did it as scientists to find out, what the impact could be if people got really greedy with spray. We nicknamed it the Mordor treatment in the end. And so you can see how dynamic, this is one of the most productive temperate forests in the world, right? These stands change really quickly. So this is just 4 years later into 2015. You can still see that in this intensive stand, there's not much in between the Douglas fir. And in the control, of course, it's incredibly diverse and lots of different plants. So this is what our blocks look like. We have the 4 colors that I showed you, control through intensive, and then we replicated that 8 times throughout the whole Oregon Coast Range. So it was a massive study funded by the USDA actually, and Oregon State as well. So just to give you an idea of the data we collected in these places, there are 4 treatments. We measured direct biodiversity effects. So how does herbicide reduce shrubs and trees? How does it affect plants? Then we also collected moth data using blacklight traps in each stand. We collected arthropods using sweep nets and pitfall traps and pollinator watches at flowers. We had camera traps out for ungulates, deer and elk. Pollinators also, we were doing flower watches for. And then finally birds, we had 3 point counts in each one of these stands for a total of 96. So it was probably the most ambitious study we've all done as a group, and in total with 140,000 detections of 835 taxa, and that we just had to do morphospecies for a lot of arthropods because we couldn't identify them. So the fact that it's described that in what, a minute would make a lot of the field assistants on this project absolutely kill me, probably. So does biodiversity decline with increased timber production? What you're looking at right now are data. We watched these trees grow. These are the Douglas fir. And then we built a model that projected out to rotation age at around 40 years, in this case, 40 years. And we projected how much more timber you'd have at 40 years with the different sprays. Okay. So green control through red intensive, and you can see the intensive is about 22% more wood than in the control. All right, so foresters in this case, they were not wrong about herbicides growing more wood, but I have to say it was less of an effect than we expected. A lot of people were saying you're going to have to get a special permit to not spray because those plantations are all going to fail, and they didn't. And this gets a little bit more extreme as you let trees grow longer, but you should know mostly in Oregon, on private land at least, we only let trees grow for 40 years before they're being cut. So yeah, we're seeing positive effects of these treatments, about 30%. What this means though, so this put yourself in the framework of how we can conserve global biodiversity and still have wood. What this means in terms of growing trees more quickly, if we spray herbicides, is that it potentially offers the chance to save more land, to have more land in reserve, because we're growing trees on a smaller area. And I will say, many of you put your hands up on the land sparing front, right? So just keep these data in mind as we move forward here. So I'm going to rush through this a bit because I don't want to run out of time, but you're going to see a lot of data on how these different taxa responded to these treatments. So woody plants obviously did way better when you don't directly try and kill them with chemicals. Same with herbaceous species. Flowers actually flip, but guess why? This is because most of the actual flowers were non-native species, and they do really well under a herbicide regime. And the same for richness. Now, you've seen those results, but we'll do birds. Birds were mostly negatively affected. Their abundance, richness, and community shift. Things start looking a lot better after 5 to 7 years, though. Pollinators, generally, richness was negatively affected by herbicides. Arthropods, the same. Abundance not different, but richness was. Moths was a shocker. We worked with Paul Hammond, who's my hero on the moth side. And in total, we ended up with 350 species of moths just across these 32 sites. And they were not strongly affected by herbicide, and neither were ungulates. So overall, 18% fewer species, mostly plants and pollinators and leaf-gleaning birds were negatively affected. And so here's the drum roll for your vote. Most of you said trade-offs, and you were correct. So woody plants, definitely a trade-off. All these negative lines you see here are a trade-off between how much wood you get and the species richness. And the results were the same for abundance as well. So yeah, every solid line is a statistically significant relationship, and the dotted ones are not. So in total, we have 5 trade-offs and a few taxa for which we see more neutral effects. For a minute, I want to take you to where I grew up in Eastern Canada. And I guess it's not time to mention I didn't tell you, but I paid for most of my undergraduate degree planting trees. I thought it would be an environmental thing to do. And it paid a lot of money in British Columbia and Ontario for college students. And that was when I started learning, wow, planting the same tree every single day, thousands and thousands of times. I wonder what the effect of that is. And the answer is this. That's my native Acadian mixed forest on the left. And this is a plantation that I didn't plant because it's a bit older than me, but you get the picture. So we did a whole region scale study on what the effects of that are on bird populations. And I won't show you the data because we've seen too much tonight, but it was really negative. We can pick it up from space. So you should know that about intensive management in your decision making, but also that in Oregon, at least, the results were not as negative as we expected of intensive management. Okay, and this is one of my favorite species. I also took this photo. Does anyone know what species this is? Any Easterners here?
Blackburnian?
Yeah, great. Holy cow, nice. Anyway, it's an amazing winters down in Colombia, northern South America, and lives in the Acadian forest of New Brunswick. All right, so I've showed you that E.O. Wilson was right. If we want to conserve biodiversity, we want to keep forests intact. It's the initial impact that tends to have the biggest effect. I've told you that old growth forest in Oregon is buffering against the effects of climate change, not just for microclimate, but also for bird populations. And I've told you that biodiversity trades off against timber production in Oregon. So these are the bits of information going into this decision. And we know that it seems pretty difficult to get away from the fact that we've got this tight correlation between the more humans we have on the planet, the more stuff gets consumed. And that is the case, certainly the case for wood, as we've covered. So where and how should we get our wood? And we'll put it in parentheses food, because it seems also an important thing, although not my focus. So the survey is, and you don't have to vote right away, do we eliminate spray? So we ban it. Lincoln County did this a number of years ago, challenged in court. Save the old growth. But, you know, we don't get to the rainforest very often, so we'll get our wood from there. Do we spray? Just go for it. We're going to grow trees as fast as we can in Oregon or any other productive forest. That's going to enable us to save the old growth, and it's going to save the rainforest. Do we eliminate spray? Again, we ban it and we save the rainforest, but really old growth, you know, there's a lot of it. We could probably do without some of it. We could cut that. Or D, do we? So I actually am gonna go through with this. Who says A? Nobody. Who says B? A few. Okay. Who says C? Well, that's a happening. It's going to happen now, right? We've got to increase the production off Willamette National Forest in the next couple of years. Hopefully it doesn't. And then who says D? There we go. Okay. Yeah. So this is obviously just an exercise, but I think it's really important for us to start thinking globally when it comes to some of these issues, and to be thinking about our own consumption practices and our own investment practices. If you look at your portfolio that you feel really good about being a green portfolio, look at some of the companies there and then think about some of these trade-offs. All right. So can we have our wood and conserve it too? We'll see. We're not doing too well so far. And as for cake, I did not take this picture. This is, you can tell by the pixels that it's not even my kid. And and yes, smaller portions, please. So thanks everyone for listening. And I don't have time to thank all the funders and people, but it's obviously a group project, all of this. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I have 50% chance, 50% chance of grabbing the right mic. I think I did it. Wow, great talk. I have to stand over here because that projector is going to make me crazy. Questions for Matt? You know the drill. Make it easy for me. Bonnie.
If you think of, I know this is us here, but if you think of the far northern forests, Siberia, Alaska, Scandinavia, etc., where they had a almost a monospecies forest, and then they shifted to industrial forest with possibly different monospecies. I know that's not what you study, but how does that affect when you go from a limited species forest to another limited species forest?
So the question then is, I guess looking to the north of us, when you look at forests that have been, say, heavily managed and shifted into from a monoculture, or from originally nearly a monoculture to a monoculture and a management routine, how would that be expected to affect, say, biodiversity?
Mhm.
Get that right, Connie?
That's a very good question, and I'll pull the scientist thing here and say that in Canada, mostly, even though they're monoculture plantations, they're native monoculture plantations, so places that were growing black spruce, I mean, they are still mixed. I think there's even in the northern boreal, you see mixed species, jack pine, black spruce, aspen, and but generally in Canada, at least they replace with one species, but at least one that's matched the site. That's certainly different in places like Scotland where they're planting Douglas fir.
Right, yeah.
And highly controversial. And I think the easy answer is that it's not great. Native species of herbivores are not adapted to those plants, and they won't do as well. And I've been in some pretty deep, dark plantations of Douglas fir in England, and there doesn't seem to be a lot going on there. But,
Very quiet.
yeah. I will just, a follow on though, is that the further north you go, the less quickly trees grow. And it does seem silly in places, especially like where I grew up, that we're wrecking it so much for so little growth per year. Whereas in Oregon, we get up to a yard of growth in a single year, 4 or 5 times.
Right.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you what you thought about whether it's possible for areas that have been under very intensive forest management, like up around Valsets would be a good example. Is it possible for areas like that to ever really recover? Or, if they're unrecoverable, just try and use those areas, spray there, just use them for timber production, they've already been burned. Or is it possible for them to recover?
So the question is, in places where they've been under intensive forest management, is it possible for them to recover? And if not, should we just focus our efforts in sort of tree farm fashion and continue to spray and cut?
And stay out of the old growth and rainforest by using those areas.
Yeah, that's an extremely topical question, by the way, like a focus of international policy type question. There's a guy called John Tapner, who is a silviculture professor at Oregon State, and he went around looking at growth rings in old clear cuts in the Coast Range to try and get an estimate of what density old growth grew up in. How dense were those trees when they were baby old growth? And the answer was really not. Because of repeat burn cycle and because of competition with shrubs, Douglas fir grew up really widely spaced. And so his argument was those plantations are no analog. They're not like anything that we would have seen historically. There was some debate around that because in other parts of the Pacific Northwest, people have found some evidence of dense young forest, young conifers. That doesn't answer your question about whether you could restore them. I think if you really went for it, you could. But I think you'd need to reduce the number of stems down substantially and wait a few centuries. But then this question of whether we should just keep growing our wood there is a really deep and complex question without a ton of data. The question is, how resilient are our soils? And the thing that keeps me up awake at night actually about the land sparing model. So let's have the reserves and then we'll grow all the wood over here. And we grow our wood, we grow our wood, we grow our wood. And eventually productivity starts dropping. And we have not seen that in the Northwest yet, as far as I know. But there's a little bit of ego there, isn't there, to say that it's going to be fine, and no insect's going to ever come in and eat all this perfectly, spaced food. So, yeah, the way to do it is through adaptive management. You keep an eye on soil productivity, make sure you're monitoring it, keep growing those trees until it starts not looking good. But the worry is that if they ever really fell down, then people start eyeing the reserves as a source of wood. Yeah, and feel free if you don't make me feel good by asking questions, because I know we're here an hour now, so. Yes.
I have so many questions that I would keep people here
Uh-oh.
overnight, but. So I used to live next to old growth forest in the North Umpqua. And in 2020, the fire came through and it was unbelievable how severely old growth forests were hit by that fire. And so I used to be, and just for example, I'm not a scientist, but I used to ride my bike down these Forest Service roads in the midsummer, and I was cool. And last year I rode my bike to my favorite waterfall, and I had a stroke because all the trees were burned. So I am in this huge conflict about how do we preserve old growth forests as climate gets warmer? I mean, is there a way to prevent high severity fires? Or is that just gonna take up what we have left and there's nothing to do about it? And I feel like I've been working on forest conservation all my life, and I'm kind of, after the fire now, I've got all these questions on what's the right path to take as we go into hotter climate. Is
Yeah.
fire always good?
Yeah.
I'm gonna give this a go. So it seems like, I'm listening to you, that maybe the question is, how do we deal, there's a conundrum that we have here, right? We want to preserve our old growth, both as for buffers against climate change, but at the same time, as climate change continues, those old growth are going to be more and more at risk of catastrophic fire. And so I'm trying to get the question there, is the question, how do we proceed with that in mind, or how do we make our peace with it?
I think that's a question. But you know, there's areas of second growth and plantations around, or I don't even know if in that case of 2020 fires, if there was anything that could have helped them. No.
I don't think so.
In the future, is there anything, any sort of treatments we can use to help prevent that catastrophic fire or not? Is the best thing just to let things?
Okay, so there's the question, then, is there anything we can actively do to prevent those big catastrophic fires?
Yeah, and again, I'm not just trying to make you feel good about your questions, but that's a really topical question for forest policy in the Northwest. So right now, just finished was a revision to the Northwest Forest Plan. It's in the process, maybe government works again of being approved. And one of the most hot button issues was between Jerry Franklin, who was one of the designers of the Northwest Forest Plan originally, and some newer, younger scientists about the role of fire in these systems. And I have to say, I tend toward Jerry's thought that I'll back up. When the Lookout fire came through, what was my first reaction? It was, some of my favorite old growth forests in Oregon are burned now. I think I might have even said gone, which of course is not true. 90% of the biomass is still there. It was really hard. It's hard to lose that old growth forest when we've removed so much for wood. So my tendency is to want to do whatever we can to try and conserve the remaining. Now the question is, do we conserve it by disturbing it? And some would argue that historically, indigenous practices did result in some fire escaping to these old growth, which reduce fuels. Mixed evidence for that at the moment, but people are looking at fire scars to find out the degree to which that holds across the west side of the Cascades. Yeah, so in Oak Ridge, it turns out there's a lot more fire in the system than people thought. So that might be the way to go about conserving old growth. Up near the Andrews, we're seeing less of it in fire scars. So maybe fire is not the way to conserve old growth. What Jerry, I think, would like to see would be landscape level forest practices around our most valuable old growth patches that try to preclude fire spread. But that's a tricky thing to do as well.
So is he thinking of doing prescribed burning or thinning? Brush clearing, what are those treatments look like that he's talking about?
Yeah, right. And so that bit remains a bit vague. We know quite a bit about how to reduce fuels and fire on the east side. We don't really know a lot about whether it's gonna affect fire spread on the west side. There's no, I mean, when you look at Holiday Farm, it was just a furnace blast. Seems like no matter what kind of forestry you did, I was just gonna move. The Andrews was a different case entirely. Really interesting. Has anyone been out there since the fire? Yeah, okay, a few of you have, and we haven't published anything on this yet, and we're just in the process of trying to get good data. But if anything, actually, those closed canopy plantations with nothing between the canopy and the understory did not seem to burn much. In some cases, the fire was creeping around them, or just very gradually in the understory. So, yeah, so I mean, one option on this is a total hypothesis. Don't repeat this anywhere. We let our plantations grow to be older than 40 years. They're closed canopy, they're relatively cool compared to an industrial plantation. Maybe that's the break we could get, not in a holiday farm situation, but in a lookout fire situation with mixed severity
So
fire.
you're saying keep the canopy closed, which plantations do?
Old plantation,
Old.
which by the way, the ones at the Andrews,
Plantations.
60 plus. The ones at the Andrews are almost no analog. I mean, there are a bunch of them on federal lands a bit like that, but they've done a lot of thinning. So they're, yeah, it's something you have to be patient with.
Got to cut in, and we have one Zoom question I want to give.
It's just a tiny question.
Tiny question.
It's just a tiny
Give it a
question.
tiny mic.
Somebody was very curious about that orange bird at the end. Somebody identified it correctly, but many of us didn't hear what the name of that bird was. And we were very curious.
Oh, yeah, black burning and warbler.
Black burning warbler. There you go. Okay, that was an easy one. All right.
I like this, the whole thing with the soil health is, it doesn't seem like you're speaking to that much to say like, you know, all trees and everything depends on like fungi. And like, how is that being affected? Because if you have those clear cuts, which is baking the ground and you're just growing the same thing over and over, the diversity, that's gonna go down. Maybe climate change is decreasing that. And, you know, you can't grow Douglas firs without it, so what's being studied on that? I'm not seeing anything about.
Yeah, that's, and your next speaker should be Suzanne Samart, who would give an excellent talk about that. Her students in my lab group, and she spent her whole career looking at below ground mycorrhizal associations. And on the east side in British Columbia, she very much found what you're describing. You know, without legacies of living trees, these below ground networks don't do well. If you look at plantations in Oregon, it is different. You know, there's a law that says you need to keep 2 green trees per acre. Try and find that. You know, we don't do very well with that, and yet our plantations are growing really well. So there's a lot more work to be done on regional differences and how many rotations you can have before that mycorrhizal component goes away. At the Andrews, there are a whole bunch of people who aren't me looking at the importance of mycorrhizal fungi. And also needle endophytes. So a lot of people don't know this, but there are fungi in needles. And these needles confer an amazing anti-herbivory service. And so what about those? You know, how do we keep those populations healthy too? But you're absolutely right about the below ground.
Yeah.
Really important stuff. Yeah, keeping that microbiome alive.
So I have another fire related question. And comment. So one, I want to push back against what you said about fire sometimes escaping into the forest from indigenous practices, because I know in the Southwest, fires were very intentionally
Deliberate, yeah.
and they're deliberate and forest management. So I would rather, I think probably up here, probably all of the management, at least from native friends I've talked to and their oral histories. And in the Southwest, we've done a lot of research showing that forests got bigger, they grew very well with these sort of management, and there's also been active prescribed burning in managed forests there for a lot longer. The Wallapai tribe has been doing it, like, I've been doing really well on their reservations since the early 50s. They got out of that sort of fire is always bad mindset a lot sooner than the rest of us. And so I was wondering what sort of research is being done with prescribed fire up here and looking at how that affects biodiversity, what the growth rates are in comparison to spraying, if that can be used to keep undergrowth lower and increase productivity instead of spraying. So I'm wondering what sort of research is being currently done on that, and if there isn't much, Who we talk to? Who we-
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
so the question, sorry,
There's a lot of questions in one, but I guess my main question is, what sort of research is being done up here to look at prescribed fire as management, maybe in contradiction to or in against spray?
yeah, so what then would, so given that indigenous burning practices have been going on for a long, long time, and they're being used successfully in other places like the Southwest, what kind of body of research is there exploring the possibility of using indigenous burning, prescribed burning, let's say, as an alternative to herbicides and that sort of method of quote unquote intense forest management?
Yeah, great. And I'll start with saying, if the impression was I thought it was just a mistake, certainly not. And those fire scar data from Oak Ridge that I described show sequential, relatively regular interval fire scars that would indicate something deliberate about it. So that's in that part of the world. At the Andrews, we're quite sure that it was a kind of a hotbed of indigenous use, especially up along the ridges. We're finding, since the fire, we're finding tons of archaeological artifacts. It's just amazing. And likely they lit higher elevations on fire. That's what maintained those mountain meadows. My own hypothesis is that those lit in the top and might have moved down into the valley. But there's, yeah, a lot of growing knowledge on how indigenous people use these more northern Cascade landscapes. What research is being done on prescribed fire? In the valley here, lots, I mean, hopefully we're going to move more and more to restoring some of our oak systems with prescribed fire. That's just, it's well known culturally, and we even know in terms of the evolution of these species that respond well to fire. In terms of fire in old growth, I told you this, and there's a lot of uncertainty around whether or not that's something that would actually reduce the risk of fire spread. And then in terms of industrial practices, we used to burn. When I say we, I mean people 40 years ago, right? Like it was a typical fall when, after the clear cuts happened, they burned to suppress competing veg. And people hated that, mostly. They hated that because the air quality declined so much. It wasn't just the forest, it was the fields as well. So it's a really controversial practice. And actually, I just 2 days ago, I was in Springfield trying to convince the Forest Service to do some prescribed burn experiments, in particular on lands that are already burned. I don't know if you know this, but you probably do because you live in a fire-prone area. The risk of fire after fire is really high. Scary, it's dry, it's hot. I've just shown you that. And so the experiments we want to run are, could we use fire as a way of reducing that fuel load, like a reburn? Anyway, I could talk about this for a really long time. I would say there's not enough research on prescribed fire on the west side as a way of regenerating trees. But I'd say at least half of that is social science, because it will depend a lot on people's acceptability of. And if you go up to Blue River and suggest lighting something on fire voluntarily.
I saw a bunch of hands go up. Let's take one more question. Matt, can you hang out for a little bit? If you want to come down and chat with you.
So about the way that I've seen clear cuts done on the sides of hills where is there science to support that you can do this on the side of hills and not lose all your topsoil within a couple of years later? I mean, I'm just baffled by things I've seen here.
So the question then is related to clear cuts on steep slopes and what that means for soil loss. And I'm really paraphrasing here, but it's really worth it.
Is that, somebody studied that?
Some of the early experiments of the Andrews were clear cut entire watersheds, and in particular look at water yield and sediment yield. And to my surprise, the roads are the major origin of a lot of that sediment runoff. And I'm a biodiversity person, right? So I'm now out of my field, but I can describe to you that two things happen. Water yield goes through the roof. You don't have those big trees drinking water anymore. And so water really comes down, which you think would increase erosion. But the roads are the major contributor of erosion and landslides as well. Something interesting happens about 3 decades after the clear cut. You have all these young trees growing up, and now they're consuming water at faster rates than old growth, and the water levels drop way below what they were in old growth watersheds. So, yeah, but I've often thought the same thing. But it has been measured, and the impact is not as high as one would expect in terms of the soil itself, especially in these productive forests. It must be that things grow up fast enough that limits some of the impacts. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Let's thank Mel one more time.